some steps forward for local government in activating their actors during this next phase of post-COVID recovery. So let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all residing today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name's Dr. Rob Lang. I'm Chair of RDA Sydney, and I'm the moderator of the discussion today with our guest speakers, Chris Newman and Luke Kenny, who I will introduce in a moment. My job is to do two things: to make this as interactive as possible, so please post any questions you may have, and to finish this webinar on time in just 1 hour. But first, a bit of background. In recent times, we've all been hit by a series of unfortunate events: droughts, floods, bushfires, and then, of course, coronavirus. The impacts have been unprecedented on people, on property and infrastructure, on lives and livelihoods. In the process, local economies have been hit hard, and councils are in a unique position to assist in the economic recovery of their regions going forward. Today, we're going to explore the role that local government procurement can play in that recovery. And we not only have two experts who can share their insights with us, but we're joined online by over 295 practitioners to add their collective wisdom to the discussion. So let me start with some introductions. I have some background in local government as CEO of Parramatta City Council for 6 years. And in that time, I saw the benefits of collaboration in procurement processes, collaboration with local businesses, collaboration within the teams of council, and collaboration, of course, with other councils. And I'm keen to explore some of those themes today. RDA Sydney also has a focus on collaboration, on jobs, on economic development, and working with government and industry to get great regional outcomes. Let me also welcome Chris Newman, who's the Co-M.D of ArcBlue Consulting, which has offices all over Australia and New Zealand, Hong Kong and Singapore, specialising in social and sustainable procurement. Chris is passionate about procurement and dedicated to the way it can drive change, not only across organisations, but across regions by creating positive impacts on communities and employment and economic growth in the environment. Luke Kenny is CEO of Local Government Procurement and responsible for an excess of $800 million in annual local government spend under contract. He's a member of the National Procurement Network and oversees a procurement consultancy practice and training business. With an MBA and a communications degree, he has some great insights to share on the issues today. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Chris, can I start with you? Tell me a little bit about what you do and what you think the key issues are.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob, and great to be here, everyone. And thanks to RDA and Economic Development Australia for having us for this session today. It's a great timing, I think, and the amount of interest in this session shows that. I think we are starting to see the way things start to have some good signs in terms of opening up. And really important, I think, for the two topics today, one, talk about local government. So what roles local government can play in actually supporting this economic recovery process. And in particular, what we want to focus on today is around procurement. So we've been working for, this company, ArcBlue, has been going for about 7 years, and working before that in government, really looking at the roles that procurement can play. How do we, as procurement professionals and as people around the sector who are involved in working with suppliers, what can we be doing strategically to have an impact in our community, in our economy, both in terms of social and sustainable, but also in terms of driving savings and value within our organisations. This next period, I think, creates a real opportunity for some of the work that we've talked about for a long time, and really around social and sustainable procurement, really focusing on what we can do to understand our supply chains, to provide support to our local suppliers, to be strategic in our decision making, to use data and technology, to collaborate, and they're all the topics that we will work our way through today. ArcBlue works right across the country. We work with over 200 councils over the last few years, as well as with other levels of government and private sector, all around the basis of what can procurement do and how can it play a role in delivering on the critical issues of importance for our communities and our organisations. And I think an ideal chance for starting to open up this conversation and look at the way forward, and to help us start to plan for how we can more strategically think about our procurement practices to drive change.
Fabulous. Thanks for that, Chris. You've raised some great topics, which of course we'll come back to. Luke, tell us your story and what do you think is important in the context today?
Thanks, Rob. And again, like Chris, thank you for having us, and it's good to be here. The local government procurement story is we've been around for 13 or 14 years now, and we're focused on delivering procurement initiatives for councils in New South Wales. They come through our panel contracts, which is where that $800 million worth of spend comes from per annum. There's 30 odd contracts in that suite. We also deliver a fee-for-service procurement consultancy. We have a sustainability procurement consultancy called Sustainable Choice. And we run training programs across the sector in the context of how to be better at procurement. That includes just some standard training, but as well as some qualifications, helping professionals in procurement build their credentials in the space and improve the procurement profession. Based here in Sydney, working with 128 councils, the ROCs and JOs. We work with a series of partners, ArcBlue is one of them, vendor panels another, that help us deliver the work that we do, and purely focused on enhancing capability in the sector in procurement. I've been here for 3 years. We've seen we've had some good times in terms of change, introducing new things, and we continue to do that to help again innovate and evolve the capability of procurement in local government. That's our focus. Look, for me on this topic, Rob, and what we're talking about today, it's pretty pointy for us. New South Wales Council has been heavily hit with disasters. We go back to September when we started the bushfires, and they raged for 272 days, I think. And many councils, particularly regional councils, were devastated by those fires. The irony was a lot of those fires were put out by floods, which caused further damage. And then you've got still, even before the bushfires arrived, we're in drought. Everyone remembers the drought we were in, and that's still going for some councils. So those three disasters are not finished with in terms of the recovery or even ongoing. And then COVID-19 hits, which really does impact recovery. And I know in talking to councils that that's part of the challenge, is they were geared to recover. COVID-19 has hit, which has really impeded their ability to recover, particularly as local economies. I think procurement's got a role. We're seeing funding flow very quickly in the notion of bushfires, in the notion of drought and supporting flood. And even this week in New South Wales, you've got the New South Wales State Government releasing $395 million worth of economic stimulus in the wake of COVID-19 for councils, which is a great thing, and will help drive some of that economic growth. And I think that's important, but this is where procurement comes in. All that money's got to come in and go somewhere. And I think part of our challenge is what are local government going to release in terms of projects to get the economy moving, to keep people in jobs, to help businesses stay viable, even to employ the people who've lost their jobs in those economies, with all that stimulus money coming through, and this ability to start to try and generate and have that responsibility. I think also we need to look at, or maybe this is an opportunity, we'll get to it later, an opportunity to engage more of our local businesses. This is an opportunity to be quite deliberate in a local business engagement. When we look at our local economies and how they've been decimated, when we look at how many people have lost jobs, there's no better time to engage local. And I think that's going to be an important thing coming out of this process. And that includes not just the big businesses getting up and employing people, but those smaller ones, coming back to them, looking at them, having a sense of, or a duty of care to their survival through this process. And I also touch on startups here. This is an opportunity, I think, for the real little people who see an opportunity to create something in this chaos. And do we as local government have an ability or a preparedness to engage them and bring some innovation into the space? I think all that goes back to adaptability. That's going to be our challenge from a procurement perspective. Can we change and adapt? What practices are we going to change? Which ones are we going to adopt? Maybe there's some practices in there we need to let go. And what decisions do we need to make to let go of them? How do we enable ourselves to shift as procurement and local government? And I think if we can do some of these things, those challenges facing procurement can also be our greatest opportunities. That's where I think we are right now.
Fantastic. They're all fabulous issues. I want to come back to the project-led recovery. I want to come back to local jobs and particularly small business and how we can impact on that. And I love your point about adaptability. Now's a time in the post-COVID world to do things differently, and I think that's going to be a topic of some discussion today as well. So let's get started. We've already got some questions, and can I ask everyone, if you have any questions out there, please type them into our Q&A and we will get to them and answer as many of those as we can. But I'm going to start off with a question about strategy. At the moment, councils are beginning to review their strategies and developing priorities about what would have the greatest community impact, and of course would allow the local economies to be reactivated. And so the first question to you, Chris, if I may ask, is that what steps should council be taking now in looking at their procurement practices to engage and support local business, to encourage local jobs and reactivate local economies? And have you got any good examples?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So let's work through a couple of these ideas, I think, in some more detail, and we'll keep coming back to a couple of these points. But one of the first things is to understand what you spend. So one of the keys that we focus on is around data. It's about understanding your numbers. What are you spending? How much are you spending? How often? How much of it is local? Understanding who your supply market is. So who is local that you're not buying from, and why not? What are some of the barriers to why we're not choosing to buy local? Some recent work we did in the Geelong region, we did a survey about 160 organisations. 90% of them felt that buying local was important. Less than 10% had ever done anything systematic about it, had ever really sat down and looked at their individual supply chain decisions and really looked at what else could they be doing to buy local. We also want to think about what decisions are going to have the biggest economic and job impact. There's really interesting data available through programs like RemPlan and ID Profile and others that enable us to think about, for certain types of expenditure, we're going to drive significant job impacts and economic impacts. So let's start to understand that. Let's understand where we're spending our money, where are there opportunities to move more money locally, and where are we going to have the biggest significant impact from an economic modelling point of view. So there's a data component there. It's about understanding our forward procurement plan. So what's coming up next? As Luke said, we're already seeing money start to flow. We know that councils are one of the best ways to drive economic stimulus, because they not only spend money locally, they also spend money in ways that make sense locally and fit locally in terms of driving the sort of outcomes needed. So they're very attractive to all levels of government. But traditionally, we haven't necessarily been as strategic as we need to do about how we're spending that money. So all major projects should have social and local procurement plans built into them. Step-by-step processes to make sure that we maximise the local economic and social impact. So that means we need to think about unbundling. We want to involve local tier 2s and 3 construction companies, for example, not only head contractors. That means we need to put local economic contribution weighting deeply into our contracts, so that becomes an absolutely critical assessment criteria. So even if there aren't local contractors that are able to deliver, there's every incentive for larger contractors to come in and try to maximise their local subcontractor spend, employment spend, material spend. Really working not only in terms of what goes into the tender documents, but what happens on the ground. So deliberate support for local supplier briefings, brokering solutions. One of the examples Rob refers to is the work that we do across a number of programs in Victoria, in particular the GROW program in Gippsland, which focuses in on looking at the $1 billion worth of spend that state government is spending in that region, and working very actively with both the buyers and suppliers to try to broker local solutions that will maximise the positive economic and job impact of that expenditure. Those programs are tried, tested and proven, and we're in a position now where, far from just saying that economic development is important, it's become critical. A couple of other points to make: segmenting our major suppliers and going out and talking to them right now. What are they doing? What could they do? What else could they do to drive local development? We tend in councils to get very caught up in the documentation side of procurement. This is an opportunity to be building relationships with our key suppliers and working with them to look at what opportunities they can present. And not to forget some of the smaller spends. So really understanding we need to change behaviours across all of our buyers across council. So we need to look at, and we'll come back on some of these issues about opening up panels, providing more opportunities for our smaller suppliers to participate, making sure that our suppliers are on the statewide panel so they're also getting every other opportunity that's available, and looking at ways we can use technology to make those buying decisions easier, because they're not normally centralised in procurement. And the final one for the moment is just to touch on supplier capacity building. one of the great examples councils have got is that they are not only procurers, they are involved in economic development. They support businesses. They act as leaders in the community. But often we operate, often those things are not really brought together in a strategic way. So this is the time to do that, to move to that next level. But we need to plan for it. Otherwise the money starts arriving and we do things the way we've always done it. And we find ourselves realising that we haven't delivered the kind of benefits we want to deliver. So a really important stage right now, I think, to be doing some of this pre-work, and which is going to be the enablers for the next stage.
Fabulous. Look, I want to come back to a lot of the issues you raised there. The data one, the one about partnerships. There's some really good points, but let's hold those thoughts for the moment. I want to go to Luke next. And Luke, you mentioned earlier that to some extent, this is going to be a project-led recovery. The government's got a big kitty of cash, and there are some huge infrastructure opportunities out there. So what do you think this is going to play out in terms of procurement?
I think there's some opportunities here for councils on a number of fronts. Not only we've talked about the disaster recovery funding, the economic stimulus, and the push that's been towards construction to get economies moving. That was even prior to all of these events happening. And again, I go to New South Wales, and all the infrastructure that's happening here in New South Wales is absolutely an economic stimulus strategy. It applies here again. And I go back to the disasters, and we've seen assets burnt, we've seen bridges washed away, and they're already looking at how do they start to rebuild those particular assets and use these projects to help not only channel funds, but then picking up some of Chris's points, bringing that local economy back together, looking at supply capacity. How do you bring the big and the small together to contribute together and start to work on these projects? But if council doesn't lead them, they're not going to happen. If council or local government takes too long to deploy these into the market and oscillates between decisions and strategy and all these sorts of things that we're typically wound up in, I think sometimes, there's a real opportunity with this funding, with this situation that we're in, to move projects quickly. And this might be a context of talking about, well, which ones can we do right now? And even the federal government's talking about bringing forward some roads money in what they call shovel-ready projects. If councils can look for those ready projects to deploy in a matter of weeks, I think we start to see an ability for council to bring people to them, start on these projects. The community sees some activity. They see some things happening. They see some things as they're driving along the street, and they're noticing councils moving again. I think this is our opportunity. We're starting to build the small things. Then we move on to the bigger things, and slowly councils being able to start to communicate what it's doing. And all of a sudden, their website's lit up with RFTs they're releasing and engagement with different suppliers, and there's some activity. I think once the activity starts, typically construction does that. Once the activity starts, people start to get that momentum. There's a little bit of optimism around what's coming. Disaster's done that. This funding's going to do that. And I think particularly when we look at roads and we look at asset replacement, we look at some projects that might have been in their planning, their community strategic plans being brought forward a little bit, saying actually we could bring that park forward now. We have some money to fix that road. We need to rebuild that asset. Local government's opportunities to prioritise those and look at a balance of what's going to be big and significant, but equally what can be done in a very short space of time. So we can start to see the money turning in the economy. It does start to get some momentum. Those big projects hit. They're already rolling. The community's seeing activity again. We're seeing money being spent. There's some engagement happening. And I think that's going to be important. As we go along and bringing it back to procurement, they're going to be key in these construction projects. They're not all going to be able to do them all together. And I think this is the opportunity from a procurement perspective, is to become involved in supporting that economic development and those strategies being deployed.
Fabulous. Look, thanks for that. I just noticed a few questions coming through already. And just coming back to you very quickly, Chris, there was a question here about, I note the Grow You example mentioned at Geelong and at Gippsland. Is there a case study available so we can study and possibly replicate?
Yeah, so just to let you know, just with RDA Sydney, we're going to send out some information following this webinar to everyone who's registered, including a couple of slides. Happy to put some reference points to the Grow programs in that document. There's some terrific stuff on the G21 Grow website, as well as the Grow Gippsland website. We'll send some linkages through some good examples and case studies as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on. Chris, you mentioned earlier about social and sustainable procurement policies. Clearly, that's a very interesting topic when we talk about local economies in particular. But who is doing that now? And can you give examples of the benefits? And some of the questions are coming in along that same line.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think it's really important. And I guess a couple of things to say is that this is what we've started to see over the last few years is governments and private sector of all sorts starting to recognise procurement not only as a commercial lever, but as a lever to achieve a broader range of goals. And what we've seen leading organisations do is to establish social procurement or social and sustainable procurement frameworks or policies and programs in place. And what that locks in is at every stage of procurement, from the annual planning processes to what goes in the evaluation criteria to what's going in the contract management plans to what's been measured and tracked, incorporates not only the traditional quality, risk, cost aspects of procurement, but incorporates a range of social impacts, economic impacts and environmental impacts. When you've got those frameworks in place and you've built the toolkits or guidance and you've got the measurement capability in place, then when a situation like this happens, you're in a position to incorporate some of these newer elements, a stronger economic focus, for example. You're in a position to adapt. We've seen procurement policy used at a federal level in terms of the Indigenous procurement policy highly successfully to ramp up Indigenous spend in Australia to over $1 billion. We've seen the Victorian state government put in place a social procurement framework which now makes mandatory social procurement inclusion across 281 buying agencies. We've seen a number of councils and other organisations take a leadership role in this area. I think what we're suggesting is that, yes, this is about local procurement. It's also about social procurement. It's about job generation, employment. It is also about making sure that some of the people who've got barriers to employment in our communities are given opportunities. Social procurement is a powerful vehicle for doing that, as well as making sure those environmental elements are properly incorporated as well. So I think what we're recommending is this is the wake-up call or the push along for that next stage of making sure that we build into our organisations that ability to take a broader view of procurement, to build in the capacity to be driving local social and environmental goals as a core part of what we do. It shouldn't just be this sort of occasion we start to think about local procurement. This should be something we're thinking about right through the way we procure. And this is a great chance, I think, to take really a bit of a leap forward for the sector in really taking a comprehensive viewpoint on this topic.
Chris, just another question that's coming through the Q&A. It's councils are sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, are not real good at the emphasis on local, even though they think about it. I think the figure you mentioned was 90% are thinking about it, but only 2% are doing it. Where can we find evidence to advocate for effective local procurement policies? Where do we show examples so we can convince our councils that this is a good idea?
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think there are some really interesting examples. There's some examples that for places like Gold Coast City Council have done some very ambitious work in this area. We've seen some great examples from some of the bigger councils like Auckland and Brisbane, who've got strong focuses around local procurement. But we're also seeing it in regional councils where I think the key is people talk about sort of whacking in a 5% evaluation criteria or putting that, and that's not the story, really. Those things can play a role, but really what it's about is doing the strategic work. It's about putting the clauses into our contracts that incentivise local economic contribution. That mean that they make sure that any supplier who's participating in a project in our region is incentivised on the basis of winning work to ensure that they seek to maximise the local supply chain. And for local suppliers, it's about giving them the opportunity to participate. We know our local suppliers struggle sometimes with the complexity of our processes, with the weight of our tender documentation and requirements. So it's about strategically really understanding what are those barriers we're putting in place in front of our suppliers and how do we open up our buying processes to encourage their participation. So I think there are some really strong case studies. Again, we can perhaps put some links to some of those for you. And it's not always easy. And there are sometimes, this is an area that's still evolving. But the organisations that we see who are doing this well are really, it's about understanding your data and actually really putting in place some specific solutions that are really about opening up opportunities for others and making sure. If we look at the Victorian state government example from a social procurement point of view, the biggest thing that they did is monitor the contracts. So every month there's a dashboard that tracks the impact, and it's seen at very senior levels. So suppliers know this is not lip service, that your local economic contribution and social impact is absolutely as critical as you delivering to cost and quality. So those sorts of things can make a big difference.
I want to come back to measurement in a moment, but look, that's a lovely segue to go to Luke, and that is we've just put in some fabulous new local procurement policies. How do we make it easier for businesses to then work with council? Because that's a barrier.
I think one of the things I want to share here is councils and local governments surrounded by business for a long, long time. And I think one of the things we can look at here that's a little bit different is having councils open up a little bit with business and bringing them in and sharing what is actually coming down the line and not making it a secret, not saying we can't release this detail, but doing the opposite and actually saying to them, we're going to bring you in and we're going to talk to you about what's coming in the next 12 or 18 months. And really start to engage with them deliberately, start to communicate their programs. So those organisations, those small businesses, big and large, those local businesses can gear themselves around what might come down the line and have that in their thinking. And then that allows this dialogue to start between the council and local businesses to say, well, we talked about this project, when is that happening? What do you need from us? Can we provide some information? Making it a little bit easy for business to understand actually where local government is going. And not waiting to hear about it when they read it in the paper. So that's going to make it easier, I think, for business because they know what the council strategy is and they're actually given an opportunity to communicate and understand that strategy, not just be told what it's going to be. I think that could be a way to make it easier for business. I think another way is not necessarily always just to release requests for tenders and come and respond, but say to business, council has a challenge, it wants to achieve X. But we're going to release an expression of interest instead. And we're actually going to listen to what the businesses have got to say. And maybe they've got the solution instead of council always having to contrive the solution. And I think that might make it easier for business as well because they're now being given an opportunity to present something that's still a viable solution, but not necessarily one that council has pre-configured. And I think that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to see, to Chris's earlier point, the capacity of the suppliers, what they're bringing to the table. I think that's going to naturally introduce innovation. And I think council's actually going to be able to look at something a little bit different. And maybe we in local government will get taught something. And we thought we'd always done it this way, but all of a sudden, because we brought these people in the tent, and we've not said this is the RFT, this is the concept, we're getting some really different ideas, and that's going to bode well for innovation, future, sustainability, social, but equally to value. It might be that this EOI strategy brings a price tag that's lower, which is allowing budgets to go a little bit further because we thought it was going to be this much. Based on what we've heard, it's going to be a lot less. So I think there's I guess my point is engagement. Bring them in and allow them to have some influence on what we're doing in local government. I think businesses would welcome that, and I think they've got some great ideas, and I think it would help us with innovation.
That's a fabulous answer, and I think and I want to jump in on a little bit more on that, Luke, and just go back to you again. Sometimes the best way to look at cost reductions is to see what council can do with its the way it thinks about a tender or whatever. But I know you've got some interesting ideas about actually talking to suppliers about how to reduce their costs and hence get a better outcome for council.
It's along the same lines. It's a case of saying, look, it's difficult for procurement to do too much with spend that's already passed. But what we can do in this function is look at what's coming down the line. And when you've got some strategic partners in local government that you channel a lot of money through, let's use roads as a simple example. There's an ability to say, we've already committed and agreed this particular program. It's a forward 12-month program, say, it's worth $30 million as an example. But we're in these times now where economy is up in the air. There's lots of chaos. We're looking for savings. Don't be surprised if our local businesses are also looking for savings. That's obvious. So how do you bring them to the table and again have a very mature conversation that says, we're looking for savings? And you can say to them, I think you are too. So how do we look at that program we've committed together, and where are there ways that we could shift and change that program to take cost out of what we're doing, which is still going to give them a similar sort of profit margin? You're not trying to eat their profit, but what you're trying to do is contain the holistic spend. So the council's got some savings, they're not outlaying as much, and there's some logic to what they're doing. Some simple examples that we've seen is having a council engage, using roads again as an example, that a Borrell or a Fulton Hogan or a Downer laying the road, but saying, well, on that program, you're moving our mobile asphalt plants all over the place. If we actually recut your program, we can anchor this mobile plant here. We think we can strip X amount of cost out of this program, and it's not going to cost us anymore. We're still going to make the same amount of money. You're going to pay less. How about we try that? Now, providing the council's got the preparedness to do the shift, there's an opportunity there. But if you're not prepared to go to the table and talk about mutually, I think, we're looking for savings, you're looking for savings, where together do we think we could identify those? For me, that's a true definition of a partnership. And procurement doesn't always need to be a buyer-supplier relationship. I think it can bring people in, share some information that goes that bit further and build some trust. In return, I think you're going to get some value.
Absolutely. Chris, do you want to jump in on this cost question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important one. And I think, because we know that a lot of councils are going to be under significant financial pressure. Councils, that was my background, was 13 years in local government. And, you know, we were always struggling in terms of what we were trying to deliver. Now with particular pressures right now in terms of reductions in revenue and increased requirements, it's going to put the financial pressure on. And we've got to not only think about procurement in terms of its ability to drive economic development, but its ability to drive savings. That's one of its key roles as a procurement profession, is to look at opportunities to drive savings. And what that we've touched on, there really does need to be a more focus on that in council. So doing that detailed opportunity analysis against key areas of expenditure to understand and benchmark your expenditure against others and look for opportunities for savings. Making the most of what's out there. So there are panels that LGP and the other peak bodies and others who have in place. Are we making the most of those panels? Are we looking at, often those panels involve ceiling prices? Can we negotiate under those panels? Can we partner with councils around us to look at some volume discounts off those panels? Looking at, you know, what's understanding what are the cost inputs. So as Luke pointed out, in terms of understanding what's driving costs for our supply chain, often it's the way we purchase that drives cost, that creates costs. So whether it's how we require reporting or because of the particular geographical approach we're taking. There are some things we're seeing, for example, right now in terms of, you know, the cost of, you know, with oil prices down, what opportunities does that present in terms of it's cutting the cost of imports for some of our suppliers? Can we be negotiating with our suppliers to look for savings or additional value adds associated with some of those cost reductions? We don't always in local government take that commercial view with how we operate with our suppliers. And it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game between local economic development and cost. Obviously, what procurement is all about is balancing those objectives, and sometimes they may be in conflict, but sometimes they're things that we can work together on, is to look for ways to be more efficient and to then track and measure those savings. So that adds that layer of professionalism and being able to report what are we seeing through our approach to demand, the approach to the way we specify what we do, our approach to negotiation and working with our suppliers, and really seek to make sure, because for most councils, between 50 and 65% of our budget goes through third-party expenditure, goes through our supply chain. It's a massive part of what we spend, but it doesn't necessarily always get the priority within a council, or the level of influence, or the level of resources that might enable it to really deliver on some of the outcomes that we're talking about today. So I think it's very important that we recognise the importance of this role and of this expertise in our councils, and make sure that we properly support it during this time.
Thanks for that, Chris. One of the questions that have come through on the Q&A is that how do we break through legal advice that says early contractor involvement and early release of projects before tender is not advised. How can we do this in that sort of legal way?
I'll start, and Chris, you can have a go. But look, I think it's not necessarily contravening the procurement process per se. I think it's about what we're talking about here is communicating what's happening. We're not breaching anything by sharing what are the projects that are in play, what are the projects that we're scoping, bringing an EOI into the game. You don't necessarily need to have price. You typically don't have price. You're looking for ideas from the market, and then you might be going to a selective tender. So I don't think we're breaching anything legal here. I think and this is where we get this challenge from a local government mentality that I'm going too close to the legalities here. I might breach regulation. I might breach legislation. I think sometimes we get a little bit oversensitive, and I'm not suggesting we need to be reckless, but I think that holds us back. Your question was around how do we make it easier for business to engage our sector? I think we've got to remove some of that, and I think we've got to be quite prepared to have an honest conversation without even touching the legalities and going near them, but bringing them in. And I don't think that contests that. I think we're okay to bring them in and share.
If I just add to that, I mean, we've seen that it's a challenge for all governments. We have seen in New South Wales state government's a great example where they've done some really strong work around things like interactive procurement and competitive dialogue, which is a highly probity-rich space that they're working in with real structure, but enables a different level of engagement with suppliers through that tender process. So there are models that we can put in place. And I think we do need to start to explore some of those. It's not about it's not about extremes of throwing probity out. It's going to be critical that we're careful about how we go about it. But it is about starting to be a little more innovative in how we engage with our supply chains, because the hands-off, and this is true within a tender, so once the tender's up and running and as a contract management and management side as well as the tender process, there are some strong probity-rich processes that we can undertake, and that's the work that we do, and Luke's team and others, that's what we do, is working with organisations to help them deliver those sort of outcomes. And I think, it's a bit of a knee-jerk sometimes to say, we can't negotiate or we can't engage with suppliers or those sorts of things. And I think we are moving past that. It takes, but it does take a level of confidence, and it does take some expertise, but huge value. So I do think we, recognising it's challenging, but I think we are starting to move past some of those barriers.
It can be done. Luke, I want to come back to you on a new topic, and that is to talk about, both of you have mentioned data earlier. Luke, I want to explore with you is what's the advantage of making the knowledge, the data that's available within a council to others, and how can that help with the procurement process?
Yeah, I think as I said earlier, I think it's important to start looking at what data we've got. I think firstly, and Chris touched on it earlier on, we've got to collect the data first. And I think one of our challenges in local government is to find it. There are many, many sources of data, and it's not just in our finance system or our ERP system. There are a multitude of sources of data, and to find that and start to analyse it. So you've got your finance system, some contract spend activity, maybe some of your suppliers have got some data you can call on. It's pulling it from all different directions to make sure you've got a good data set. I think procurement professionals need to start becoming data analysts, because if we don't start analysing data, which assumes you've already collected it, and analysis assumes you understand what you're looking at and you can derive some insight, this is what we can start to share, which becomes an easier way to engage. And I think sharing that insight, you don't have to share all your minute data, but sharing the insights that you get and starting to look at what are the opportunities that flow from that data insight. This is where strategy comes. This is where ideas flow, particularly with business, from council to business. This is an opportunity where they're able to demonstrate, this is all the data we've got, this is what it's telling us. These are the issues we might be seeing, or these might be the opportunities that we're seeing. Based on that, how do we come together and put together a solution that we can resolve together? And that's initiating something, but then by sharing data, you can get into a stage of, well, once we've partnered on something, how is that data tracking and measuring success? And how do we use that to tell that story and get some momentum on the good work that we're doing? I think that's the other thing we don't do as well as we could in local government, is communicate the success stories that we have. So not only using it to create new projects, but using it to talk about what have we delivered? What's the quantifiable deliverable that we've done? And I think procurement's not great at that if we talk about procurement specifically. And I think data is an ability for us to gather that and use it in a way that shows our value. And it goes back to the point around savings. And I do maintain, and I think procurement is a profit centre. We make and save more money than we cost. But we're not great at telling that story. We need data to do that, and we need those insights to tell that story. And I think this is where we need to start sharing that data. It's not only internally, but externally. I think there's stakeholders externally, there's stakeholders internally who probably underestimate the data that we have, underestimate the insights we can provide. And I think sharing that data internally with your leadership team gives you an ability to have a conversation at the highest level in council to talk about where you can have an impact. And I think without data, with a couple of PowerPoint slides, you're not going to get there. But if you're able to go to the leadership team inside council with a good, solid data set and showing the insights and the analysis that you've got, I think we are starting to see some benefit from that.
Definitely. Chris, I want to come back to you, and hand in hand with data is technology. One thing that COVID has taught us is that we actually can do things digitally we never thought we could do before, including webinars. But how can we use this new skill that we've developed to not only get better access to harness efficiencies, but to broaden the interaction with small business in new ways?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And I just to pick up on Luke's point too, the other thing I just want to say about data is councils have often got access to all sorts of data in the economic development team, and we're seeing some great data that's coming out of Redmond, the recent business survey they've done about who's impacted by COVID. IBIS World data, which is telling us where which industries and which communities across New South Wales and Australia are most impacted by COVID. We're seeing so great data that comes out of the LEAP program that we do with LGP and with Local Buy and MAV in Victoria. So I think there is one of the problems is councils, that data often isn't brought together. So it's, so I think it's really about understanding what's possible within a council sense as well. And really starting to demonstrate the business case for why, for example, local spend and how many jobs are you creating through your local spend, and integrating not just the procurement data, but integrating it with other data sets as well. And that really does lend itself to then thinking about technology. So I guess one of the things we've seen is if we're all working remotely and we're trying to do tenders the way we used to do them, all paperwork and all sitting in a room filling out one evaluation form, and we've all been, having to do tender boxes or try to find a contract somewhere that's sitting in a drawer, we're in trouble. And we've seen that in councils right now, with councils really battling if a lot of your work is by paper. So from an internal point of view, putting in place simple, effective, configured, well-planned technology systems that enable us to do each stage of the procurement process, from planning our procurement through to going to market, through to contract management, with technology is critical. And it's something we talk about a lot, and people have done bits and pieces of it. It's really going to be important. It's cheaper and more effective than it ever was through software as a service and the kind of products available. So I think that's really critical. But that's also critical for our supply chain. So one of the challenges is we need to make it as easy as possible for suppliers to expose themselves to buyers. So one of the things that we look at, and Luke touched on it before, one of the partners we work with in our program's vendor panel is a good example of this, is providing the vehicle for easy registration for suppliers into a marketplace, and that availability then for buyers to find those suppliers and buy from without complex, particularly for the lower value spend, without complex processes. But it's really a technology-enabled procurement out to our supply chain. So I think that we're seeing, and that's some of the work that we do, and we'll provide information out to the people attending the webinar after this. But it's really about looking at what some of those practical solutions are, and how does technology enable supplier visibility? How does it make it easier to procure from them? And I think not only exposing those suppliers to our purchasing capacity, but to others. So if we can help our suppliers in our communities make themselves available, expose what they know and do to buyers from right across the state or the country, that's also an important role that we can play to help to digitally enable and act as a leader in the area.
I think just quickly to one of those things, Rob, Chris talked about go to market. I think the other thing we make it easy for business is how we go to market. And I think I think technology is going to overcome our ability to deploy massive tenders that scare away small business. And I think technology is our ability to get rid of all of that and make us a bit more approachable for the smaller business by going to market using technology platforms instead of hard copy, and allowing them to submit electronically and evaluate it electronically, put all those big pieces of paper behind us, and move into that sort of space. And I think that's a forward opportunity as well, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke. And I think, we've talked about coordination with the suppliers. We've talked about collaboration within the context of council and sharing information and data across various teams. But there's one other. How do we share with other councils so we can get better coordinated efforts, particularly for those very small councils in rural New South Wales? Would they be better off in joining forces?
I think they would be better off, and I think we're starting to see more and more of that activity, Rob. I think particularly now with all the challenges that we've just finished, the circumstances we're in with COVID and disaster and so on, they are garnering together, particularly what I see here in New South Wales with joint organisations in particular. And not only are these councils and members of those organisations thinking about how can they start to come together, it's about what those opportunities are. And I think there's a couple of factors here. In those regional areas, you'll find there's one big council and there's lots of little ones around it. And it takes that collaboration. There's a key part of its collaboration. Those big guys need to agree to join with the small people. There may not be a great economic benefit in that economy of scale, but they know they're helping the smaller people, because those smaller councils will get pricing they can never achieve by themselves. So there's this understanding, we've got a duty of care that we need to bring these people together and we need to support them. That's on one level, but then there's also the other level of compromise. So we need collaboration, but we also need to be able to compromise on what we're going to market on. We can't all have the same thing. So how do we cut that specification so everyone can participate and we'll all get the outcome out the other end? And so there are two key things, I think, in assuming some regional collaboration. There's also nothing to say that groups on groups can't come together either. And so there's groups here and some come here and they go to their neighbours, and all of a sudden you've got 30 or 40 councils mobilised together on a buying strategy. That also needs to be looked at. That's where I'd like to see it go. We're seeing some work at joint organisation level. I'd love to see that get maturity and then start to bring more people in and see a real true regional collaboration on certain things. I think that'd be a great outcome.
Absolutely. Chris, I want to come back to you on an issue that you raised earlier, and there's how do we measure success? It's not just the cheapest quote, is it?
No, absolutely. And I think that's where because as we start to think about that broader topic around social and sustainability and local, it's starting to broaden what we're measuring in terms of success. And I think one of the things that we're really seeing make a difference is incorporating into our contracts measurements around local economic contribution. So where are they spending money locally? How many employment outcomes are they delivering locally? We're also talking, and how many materials are they buying locally? Expecting reporting back on some of those requirements. Looking at social procurement outcomes, so setting targets or requirements around the employment through directly or through supply chains of people with barriers to employment. Looking at job pathways, traineeships. We're looking, so very deliberately working with those suppliers to make sure that we're putting in place requirements and measures around social impact. We're looking at environmental impacts and now around reducing carbon emissions. We're seeing some new activity that from a federal level all the way down, focusing around waste minimisation and recycling. All of those become elements that get considered in the procurement process. We then need to be able to measure those. So best practice, if we're seeing, is organisations setting organisational targets. So we're looking at, if we're currently tracking that we're spending 40% of our dollars locally, we may seek to say we want to raise that to 50% over a time period. And we know that additional 50%, if we apply our economic modelling to it, we can look at what sort of additional impact is that going to have on jobs. And we've seen some figures, some of the work that we do in these programs is that even a 5% swing in local procurement can mean tens of millions of dollars and sometimes hundreds of jobs in the local community, just through a relatively small change in our procurement practice. That goes to the next level if we start to work with our other buyers in the region. And I think one of the things that becomes very important is not just council thinking about local and social on its own, it's the leadership role that it can play and working with other key buyers, hospitals, water authorities, major construction companies, universities, working with those organisations, setting up collaborative models. We've seen it happening across the university sector across Australia. We're seeing it happen across councils. We're seeing it happen across multi-sector programs like GROW and the SEED programs, is where we're really starting to play. And I think councils have got a key role, because if you can influence their spending, you can connect them up with opportunities and you can help them start to track their local and social impact. All of a sudden you're having the opportunity to have really profound impacts in terms of your supply chain, your economic growth. So, and measurement's at the heart of that, because if we're only measuring cost and things being completed on time, that's what's going to drive us. If we are starting to also measure the local economic impact, the job creation, the social impact, those environmental measures, and measuring them at an organisational level and at a project and even a departmental level, bringing those things together is really powerful. And I think there are now the technologies that we use and others that can help us to do that. And I think it's a really, it really starts to create that ongoing business case. And, you know, to be honest, councillors love to talk about how many local jobs their projects created and what economic impact it had and how many people who were previously unemployed got a job because of what council's done. And start to demonstrate those figures to them. That is a very powerful driver for that continued commitment to local economic development and social procurement.
Thanks, Chris. Luke, your view?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, one of the more simple things, you talked about what can we start to do and how can we start to measure success. We found in our work, I think Chris may agree or disagree, but we found councils don't do enough work in analysing their vendor master file just to see how many local suppliers they are actually engaging. And for this audience, for those in this audience who could do that, I'd encourage you to go and have a look in your vendor master file. You might just surprise yourself at how many local businesses you are actually engaging. And I think that lifts onto Chris's point around then where do you take it? And once you work out what that benchmark and that baseline is, I think you really do start to get some ideas coming around. Well, actually, we've got 500 local businesses in our system that we could go and buy from today, but we haven't spent with them for 2 years. I think that sort of analysis is a really basic place to start. If you haven't gone anywhere with it, is just start with that. Look at who's in your system. Work out who's local now. And maybe look at the categories that are in the categories they're not in. And start to look at a category-based assessment on who do I want to add here, because I'm spending a lot of money, but I've got no locals. You can start to get that. That is often simple enough. And I think, Chris, that lifts into a lot of the work you guys do and what you were just talking about.
I think it does. Just to add to that, I mean, I think we can also take obviously some of what we're talking about here is about short and medium term. It's about, you know, immediate economic recovery, but it's also trying to take a bit of a longer term view. If we want to develop supply bases, look and unbundle some of our spend to levels where we know that local suppliers can participate, that helps them to deliver work, which helps them to be positioned for the next time around to deliver a higher level of work. So we actually need to actively try to incubate, support, and help to grow our local suppliers. And not only from our point of view, and that's where we can work with some of our other buyers in the region, because I think that sort of strategic long-term view about how do we, what role can we play to incubate and support businesses, in particular industries that are relevant to our procurement, for example, what roles can we play in actually seeking to build those? And that doesn't happen if we're just sitting in our room, putting a tender together, throwing it out and seeing what happens. That does require more analysis, more understanding, because sometimes we exclude local supplier participation without even realising it because of the way we're going to market. So, and I come back to trying to have not only, yes, we think about short and medium term, but this is also about building on, because council's going to still be here. And to be honest, no one cares about our community and our economy more than the local council. You know, the state's worrying about a whole state, and, you know, and I think that's where you can really also, you know, be advocating and making sure that any money that's being spent in your community, you're seeking to make sure, whether it's your money or it's state money or it's anyone else's money, seeking to influence the way that money's being spent to try to maximise the local impact as well.
we're going to have to start wrapping up because we're running rapidly out of time. But look, this is just the start of a conversation, and I just want to ask each of you to say one final point. But before we do that, just a very quick one, taking a question from the webinar chat. It's about, given the change in focus that you're talking about in terms of how procurement would actually be undertaken, does that mean, you know, focusing more on strategic procurement via data analysis and so on, does that mean that we need to redefine the procurement profession in a new way? And a really quick answer from either one of you who'd like to grab that.
I'll go first, and I'll say, as I said earlier, I think procurement needs to be a data analyst. If you want to be strategic, you've got to get a hold of the data. You've got to know where it lives. You've got to know what it says, know what it means, align it to your council strategy, and you become relevant at the leadership team level to get things done.
Thanks, Luke. That sounds great. I'm going to wrap it up there, but just Chris, the final words from you. Just a 1 minute wrap up. Anything you'd like to leave us with? Yeah, look,
we're going to send a few slides out to the group that it's going to give some examples of some of the data that's available. I guess what I'd say, I think it's a really good conversation to be having right now, and hopefully people have picked up some ideas and some practical solutions. I guess what I'd be saying is get started right now. You know, and when we talk about procurement, we're not just talking about procurement professionals, the individuals in organisations. We're talking about anyone involved in contracts and working with suppliers right across the organisation, and also engaging with GMs and with senior executive as well. It's understanding how important your supply chain is to you as an organisation, and being empowered to actually see this as not something that we just respond and react to, but something we can really influence. And making sure we use those different aspects of councils together. So we see organisations that have got sustainable procurement steering committees, or they're working together, and they've got economic development, they've got their major construction areas, they've got procurement, they've got sustainability team working together to look at how spend can be better used, how supplier capacity can be better used, integrating supplier intelligence around the economy and suppliers and procurement together. This is a great chance to break down some of those silos that sometimes hold us back within councils. I think it's also a chance to get some breakthrough outcomes in collaboration, as you've touched on, Rob, and Luke touched on as well. I think collaborating with other councils, but also go and talk to some of the other buyers in your region. We're seeing some fantastic examples of multiple organisations working together, because we're often buying similar things, we've often got similar supplier challenges, and we often have a passion for our community that we all share. And when you start talking about economic development, it does change the game. It does get people thinking. Most suppliers that you work with also are passionate about the community you're working with. So introducing these ideas, having that engagement with suppliers, I think it's a good time really to be putting this new sort of lens on the way we procure.
Thanks, Chris. Luke, final words from you?
Look, for me, I think it's not dissimilar to Chris, but I'm going to say start doing things differently. Almost now everything is different, and up until COVID-19 hit, we were travelling along in our own bubble, just operating normally, and then everything got thrown upside down. And we've shown, everyone in this audience has shown that they can do things differently. This is the perfect excuse to change something, because everything has changed. So if you're looking at engaging locally, if you're looking at rolling out technology, if you're looking at changing process, if you want to start a new project that's going to deliver new value internally, I think the people listening, this is the best time to actually make some change, because everything has actually changed. And I think decision makers in council and decision makers in business will be open to anything that's different, because now we're looking for things that are innovative, and we're looking for things that are going to help us recover. And if we're thinking cleverly about those things we put forward, and we are prepared to change, and we can show medium and long-term gain from that, this is the chance. If you don't do it now, I don't think we can complain in 6 months' time we missed that opportunity. And I think that would be my message, is look for your opportunity, take it now, because later on it might not come back.
Thanks, Luke. Look, let me wrap up with a huge thank you to both of our guests, Chris Newman and Luke Kenny. Can I also mention again that there'll be a recording available that will be sent by email to all the participants with responses to various questions as well. Again, let me please also thank our webinar partners, Economic Development Australia. And finally, on behalf of Regional Development Australia Sydney, thanks to everyone who joined us today. Goodbye. Thank you. Keep safe.
Thank you.